I'm so delighted to be here for this session. This session means perhaps more to me than any of the other sessions at this festival. Thank you for being here, and some of you for being yoga experts and sitting in the front rows. This used to be a bigger venue, and I'm sorry that it's a bit cramped this year due to something or the other. I first read the Life of Milarepa many, many years ago when I was very young, very impressionable. And the story remained with me over the years as few other stories have. It made such a deep and lasting impact that I felt the desire to briefly introduce this session as an act of personal homage, even though I am not a learned Tibetan scholar like the distinguished speakers in the panel. So please do excuse this intercession. There were many streams of knowledge, belief, and practice that met in Milarepa's life, including the ancient Bonpo religion, the residual influence of Siberian shamanism, the revered Sanskrit texts, the deep learnings of Nalanda University as embodied in his guru and master Marpa, as well as the living landscape of the highest and the youngest mountains in the world, the Himalayas. He was, in that sense, a Himalayan master. And I too am from these very same Himalayas. And so I am doubly delighted that here by the majestic Rockies, the hard-won wisdom of this greatest of Himalayan masters is presented to us by this very, very distinguished panel. I have returned a few days ago from Bhutan, where Her Majesty the Queen Mother, Ashi Dorji Wangmo Wangchuk, who was with us last year, gave me the following message to be conveyed to the speakers and audience today. As you may remember, Her Majesty, when she came here, she was delighted and she said she's going to come back and back and back. She says, "Greetings and affection I send to all of you through my friend Namita. I feel spiritually connected with Boulder and Naropa University ever since my first memorable visit last September for JLF. The great yogi Milarepa is an inspiration for succeeding generations of students over the centuries for contemplation of body and mind. He will be a guiding light for my grandson, Vairochana Rinpoche. I hope to return to be amongst you with Rinpoche. With my love and Tashi Delek." So that is from the Queen Mother. Now if I can quickly introduce a very distinguished panel. Judy Lief is a Buddhist teacher who trained under the Tibetan meditation master Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. She has edited many of his books, including Milarepa, Lessons from the Life and Songs of Tibet's Greatest Yogi, which was such a joy and pleasure to read, and his 3-volume Profound Treasury of the Ocean of Dharma. Then we have Holly Gayley after her, sitting next to her, who is Associate Professor of Buddhism at the University of Colorado Boulder. She is author of Love Letters from Golok, a tantric couple in modern Tibet, which I'm looking forward to reading, and co-editor of a forthcoming anthology of translations, The Gathering of Brilliant Moons. And then we have Andrew Quintman, who's Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Yale University, specializing in the Buddhist traditions of Tibet and Himalaya. His English translation of the Life of Milarepa was published in 2010. His latest book, The Yogi and the Madman, Reading the Biographical Corpus of Tibet's great saint Milarepa, won the American Academy of Religions 2014 award. And then we have Nikko Odiseos. I'm sure all of you know these people well, but it is my duty to introduce them. He's been the president of Shambhala Publications since 2010 and Snow Lion Publications since 2012. He spent 2 years in India studying and working with the Buddhist program in Bodh Gaya. With that, I hand over to Nikko and the mic here.
Thank you so much, Namita. And Namita's love of the Himalayas is going to be published next year, an edited collection that she put together that we're really excited about. So thank you for that. This is such a great lineup of Milarepa experts here. I mean, I think the introduction has been done, but this trio, we're very lucky to have this trio. And I think everyone who's here has some familiarity already with the subject, but I'm just going to, if I may, read a little bit from Andy's latest book, The Yogin and the Madman, because I think it sets the stage for the things that we'll be talking about today. Milarepa's life is one that has long served as a model for yogic virtuosi on the Himalayan plateau, a record for the birth of a religious tradition and the founding of its spiritual lineage, a tale of an individual's life of solitude and realization. It is a story that has been told in numerous forms, inscribed by authors, adapted by dramatists, illuminated by artisans, and proclaimed by wandering bards. It's a narrative that has become ingrained within the Tibetan religious and cultural landscape, a key element of the entity known as Tibetan Buddhism. And I'd like to add American Buddhism or Western Buddhism as well. I mean, Milarepa has had such a impact both on Buddhism here. I just did a search, and about almost 150 of Shambhala's books alone talk or include selections from Milarepa. If you just Google Milarepa, you get about just under 1 million hits. I mean, some of them are like the Milarepa guest house and things like that. But it's just so.
There's a nudist beach, I think.
I won't ask you if you visited in your research. Yeah. Milarepa has been called the greatest Tibetan poet and is considered the most straightforwardly personal of all Tibetan poets, singing again and again about his personal struggles and attainments. So we are going to kick off with some readings and then start exploring some of the themes, and we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for questions and discussion. So with that, I think we can start the slideshow, and Andy will give the first reading.
Well, welcome everyone. Thank you, Namita, and thank you, Nikko, for such a kind introduction. Thank you all for being here. It's such a thrill for me to be here and taking part in the Jaipur Literature Festival. So Milarepa is a figure that's very dear to my heart, having spent, now I realize, almost 3 decades researching the texts attributed and the stories attributed to him and seeking out his places in the Tibetan and Nepalese landscape. Has kind of culminated in this moment to be able to share it with all of you. And I actually, before I get to the readings I had planned, I want to begin this session by reading a line from the beginning of the book that Judy edited. So this is a collection of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche's teachings on Milarepa. And the very first thing he says in the beginning of this book is, the study of Milarepa's life is a very profound and penetrating experience. And I think all of us can agree with that statement. So I wanted to set the stage for our conversation about Milarepa, about his life story and the legacy of that life story in Tibet and also in the West with some readings. So I want to begin to give you an idea of his life from the most famous version of his life story. And as I'm speaking, you may notice the slides that are going in the background. I'm not going to refer to them, or we won't be referring to them as we go on, and there is no text there. But the images kind of intersperse traditional representations in painting and statuary of the Yogin Milarepa, together with photography of places associated with him in Tibet. So these are images here from near his birthplace in southern Tibet. So as we go, you can sort of refer back and forth to the stories that we're telling in the images that you see. So Milarepa was born, we think, in the 11th century in southern Tibet. He was born to a family that was quite wealthy. But while he was still a child, his rapacious aunt and uncle stole his family's wealth, so that he and his mother and his sister were basically brought into a life of servitude and destitution. It was a traumatic tale, and our story begins here with an exhortation by Milarepa's mother to exact revenge on his relatives who had stolen his rightful patrimony. So Milarepa's mother tells the young boy that you need to go and, in Tibetan fashion, study black magic, because that's how we'll extract revenge on our family who's treated us so miserably. And she says to him, I would like to see you draped in a fine cloak and mounted upon a horse with your stirrups slashing the throats of our hated enemies. Such will not come to pass, yet success is still possible by the means of treachery. So I would like you to train and become an expert in black magic, curses, and casting hail. Then you should destroy all who inflicted misery upon us, villagers and countrymen, beginning with your aunt and uncle, cutting off their family lines for 9 generations. Son, if you return without showing signs of black magic, I, your old mother, will kill myself right in front of you. So that's the setting for our story. So the story goes that he is successful in training in black magic. He casts a magical spell on the wedding party at his uncle's aunt and uncle's house and murders 35 people. The Wikipedia entry for Milarepa used to have him categorized under mass murderers. Not something you would commonly associate with Tibetan saints. He also casts a hailstorm that ruins the crop, wipes out the entire village. But then there comes a moment, which is a dramatic turn in the story, where he regrets what he's done and he seeks out an authentic Buddhist teacher. And he's so driven by the sense of painful remorse and regret for what he's done, it drives him to the brink of madness. And so he says, stepping out in a state of heartrending misery, I thought, I had provisions and gifts when I carried out evil deeds. When I practiced Dharma, I have no wealth at all. This is what has befallen me. If I had even half the gold I had when I practiced evil deeds, I would obtain initiation and oral instructions. Without wealth, I will never get the Dharma. A human body without Dharma fosters evil deeds. I want to kill myself. What to do? What to do? Well, and so what Milarepa goes on to do is to study with a famous Buddhist teacher and translator named Marpa. And the story of the training, the relationship that develops between Milarepa and his guru becomes a kind of role model for the student-teacher relationship for centuries thereafter. Mila is subjected to these great trials of constructing towers and tearing them down so that he's driven to the brink of physical collapse, and yet he perseveres. I'm going to skip ahead. After a period of training with Marpa, he returns back to his homeland to begin his career as a solitary meditator. And the first thing he does is return to his old house. And he finds that the house is collapsed, his sister has gone off begging somewhere. And there's a moment in which he's foraging around in the ruins of his home. And he finds the bones of his mother. He writes, "Then I walked across the doorstep and found a heap of rags caked with dirt over which many weeds had grown. When I gathered them up, a number of human bones, bleached white, slipped out. When I realized that they were bones of my mother, I was so overcome with grief that I could hardly stand it. I couldn't think, I couldn't speak, and an overwhelming sense of longing and sadness swept over me. I was on the verge of fainting." And I'll admit, when I was translating this passage, I also was overcome with this just amazing well of emotion. And I realized why in the life stories of other great Tibetan teachers, they often tell of how they were reading the life story of Mila and tears spontaneously came to their eyes. We get a sense of the emotional evocativeness of our story here. Mila goes on to recite one of his first poems collected in his life story about impermanence. Alas, alas, I me, how sad. People invested in things of life's round, I reflect, and again I despair. They act and stir up from their depths so much torment. They spin and are cast in the depths of life round. Those dragged on by karma, afflicted with anguish like this. What to do? There's no cure but the Dharma. So Milarepa goes on to spend the rest of his life in mountain retreats, meditating in solitude, teaching disciples. He never founded a monastery. He had no interest in such things. But he also recited Buddhist teachings in verse. Holly will talk a bit more about that. But let me give you one taste of a poem that comes up in his life story that I think well illustrates the ideal of the solitary mountain yogin whose greatest goal is to die while in solitary retreat with no one around. My happiness unknown to loved ones and misery unknown to foes, if thus I can die in this mountain retreat, the aims of this yogin will be complete. My aging unknown to companions and sickness unknown to my sister, if thus I can die in this mountain retreat, the aims of this yogin will be complete. My death unknown among people and rotting corpse unseen by vultures, if thus I can die in this mountain retreat, the aims of this yogin will be complete. Flies sucking on my putrid flesh and insects gnawing at my bones, if thus I can die in this mountain retreat, the aims of this yogin will be replete. No footprints at my doorstep and no signs of blood inside, if thus I can die in this mountain retreat, the aims of this yogin will be complete. No one to stand round my corpse and no one to mourn for my death, if thus I can die in this mountain retreat, the aims of this yogin will be complete. No one to ask where I've gone to and no one to say I have come, if thus I can die in this mountain retreat, the aims of this yogin will be complete. So that's really indicative of the kind of ethos of the solitary yogin. Now there's much more we could say about his life. Hopefully we'll do that in conversation. He lives a long life. He dies at about the age 80, like the Buddha. The scene of the Buddha's death is incredibly theatrical, operatic. He finally passes away, but he returns 7 or 8 times from the beyond to sing songs from the heavens to his disciples. I was going to read you a passage from the death scene, but let me instead just tell you a story that comes up later in the collected songs. And this is often considered to be Milarepa's final teaching to his greatest disciple, whose name is Gampopa, who went on to help to found what became the Kagyu lineage of Tibetan Buddhism. So after Gampopa and Milarepa had spent some time together, had their Gampopa completed his official training, he was wandering away, leaving his master for the last time. And when he was out of earshot, but not quite out of sight, Milarepa stands up and calls from a distance so that Gampopa turns around to look at his master. And the yogi, Milarepa, who of course is wearing nothing but a white cotton robe, that's his name, Repa means cotton clad, turns around and lifts up his robe to expose his naked backside, which of course is covered in calluses from his many years seated in meditation. And this, tradition tells us, was his final teaching on the importance not of study, not of intellectual pursuits, but of meditation, of actual practice, of sitting on the cushion. And that became the legacy of Milarepa, the sort of epitome of the yogic tradition of Milarepa. So shall we pass the mic over to...
Well, thank you, Andy, for getting us warmed up with the life story. It feels like the last few years has been a real Milarepa boom. So starting with Andy's 2 books, his translation of the Life of Milarepa and then his Yogin and the Madman, a study of that. And then 2 recent books from Shambhala Publications, one edited by Judy, which she'll be reading from, Teachings by Chogyam Trungpa on the Life, and one that is hot off the press, a retranslation of the songs of Milarepa, and that's what I would like to read from. This is by Christopher Stagg, and he's a student of Ponlop Rinpoche, and so who's a student of Khenpo Tsochom Gyamtso, who really, in our generation, you could say, has been one of the principal teachers to base his teachings on the songs of Milarepa, and has had his own translators and students do beautiful renditions to, I would say, folksy tunes, little cowboyish tunes. Works well in the Rocky Mountains. And so I appreciate that Chris Stagg, for those of you who receive those teachings or know the tunes, that he cross-references his translations with the Khenpo's titles of those songs translated by his students. So the pathos of Milarepa's life is one of the great appeals of his story. It's a tale that's so human. And if we think about what's so appealing about his songs, I would have to say that it is their folksy quality. So the Doha tradition in India really had already this sense of oral tradition for esoteric teachings, and putting those in the vernacular. So the various Prakrits or medieval dialects in India. But when this tradition moves to Tibet, what we see is that it picks up through Milarepa, and of course its influence echoes through the centuries, distinctive elements of Tibetan folk songs and their styles, their meter, the earthy metaphors, the imagery of the snow lion and other things very distinctively Tibetan. And it's Milarepa's ability to put the most profound teachings into the simplest language that I think has lent these songs their enduring quality. And they also have a tremendous amount of humor to them and kind of real life predicaments. So what I want to share with you today is an example of Milarepa, the wandering yogin, showing up in a village. This is from the chapter called Meeting Paldarbloom, and seeing a lovely young woman in the fields with all the marks of a dakini, an enlightened female figure. And she calls out to him, immediately recognizing that he is a wandering yogin and saint, and says, "Why don't you go to my house and I'll meet you later?" But then you have her grandmother, who doesn't really take a shine to this wandering yogin showing up at her doorstep, letting himself into the house. And you see this wonderful practicality of Tibetans. They're not so starstruck as sometimes Westerners get around gurus. You know, they're like, "Who are you?" And she takes ash and she's about to throw it at Milarepa. And this is one of the really interesting things in Siddha tales from India, but also continues in Tibet and Bhutan and other places, where there's this sort of question around these tantric masters, like, who is this person really? And so there's always a proof in these stories. And sometimes that proof, for example, with Varupa, who was caught eating pigeons at one of the great monasteries of northern India, and finally, people showed up to kick him out, and he said, "Well, I didn't kill anything." And they said, "Well, what are those pigeon bones doing in your room?" And he goes, and the pigeons all fly away. So that's one kind of proof, very miraculous. But Milarepa proves himself through his songs, through the quality of dharma that comes through his songs. So I wanted to bring, his interactions with female characters into our conversation. Andy began with his mother. And so Milarepa says, "Grandmother, before you throw those ashes at me, listen a little to this song of Milarepa." Now, one of the uniquely Tibetan features of the verses I'm about to read, and I'll just read a few, are that they often use ordering principles like 1, 2, 3, or above, below, and in between, or Hlan, Yen, and Lu, for those who know those terms, the divine above, the human domain below, in the middle, and then the water spirits below. So mapping onto a topography of mountains and meadows, and then the rivers and lakes. So you'll see that in this song. And also a little touch of impermanence that Andy already mentioned. So he says, 1, above is the bliss of the higher realm's freedom. 2, below is the suffering of the 3 lower realms. 3, in between are those who, without control over their birth. When these 3 things convene upon you, grandma, you're cruel and detest the Dharma. Take care of yourself and look at your mind. If you do something, practice the sublime Dharma. If you follow something, follow a qualified guru. When you first were betrothed to be in this family, do you think you'd become this kind of woman? So he really gestures to a woman's predicament, and also a little bit old age. 1, in the morning you rise so early. 2, in the evening you retire so late. 3, your work does not ever cease. When these 3 things convene upon you, grandma, you're a miserable, unpaid slave. Take care of yourself and look at your mind. If you do something, practice the sublime Dharma. If you follow something, follow a qualified guru. Then think, if you did that, would you be like this? 1, when you get up, it's like extracting a steak. These are old age references. 2, when you walk around like a waddling goose. 3, when you sit, it's like a rock hitting the ground. When these 3 things convene upon you, grandma, you're depressed with an old, spent body. Take care of yourself and look at your mind. If you do something, practice the sublime Dharma. If you follow something, follow a qualified guru. If you did that, then think, would it be like this? So you get some quality of the kind of earthy humor and the directness. And this directness really got to the grandmother. He really saw her and her predicament and responded accordingly, not with some high abstract teaching, but with something really that met her situation. And she starts weeping, of joy, and has great faith. So she's converted on the spot. But now Paul Darboom comes back and sees her, grandmother weeping, and says, Milarepa, what did you do? And she thinks, that he hit her. And so now she starts grilling Milarepa, and this turns into a beautiful exchange where he teaches her the Dharma. And Paul Darboom is one of just a small set of elevated female disciples of his that attained enlightenment. And I'd like to close by sharing with you their exchange. And this will show another beautiful example of a folk song style in Tibetan. So not part of the poetic tradition that came in from India, but really folk songs. And what it is a kind of parallelism where you have several examples or analogies that help illuminate a final referent. So the main point is kind of right at the end in the final verse. So in keeping with the song tradition, I've asked them to play this for you. And it's a beautiful, beautiful piece that's in English, in translation, turned into a duet between Suzanne Duquette and Winfield Clarke. So please enjoy.
I can't contemplate the sky, the clouds make me uneasy. Milarepa, tell me how to meditate on thoughts.
If the sky's as easy as you say, clouds are just the sky's play. Let your mind stay within the sky.
I can contemplate the sea, but waves make me uneasy. Milarepa, tell me how to meditate on waves.
If the sea's as easy as you say, waves are just the sea's play, let your mind stay within the sea.
I can contemplate my mind, but thoughts make me uneasy. Milarepa, tell me how to meditate on thoughts.
If your mind's as easy as you say, thoughts are just the mind's play. Let your mind stay within your mind.
Well, I wanted to start by thanking Namita and Nikko and Naropa for hosting this. And I wanted to focus on a little bit further along in Milarepa's life, and particularly on his relationship with his disciple Rinpoche. Rinpoche was a young boy that basically Milarepa almost adopted from an early age and raised up. And he kind of often contrasted Rinpoche and Gampopa as the two major disciples. Gampopa coming into Milarepa's life as a very highly accomplished person, having gone through incredible personal tragedies that led him to seek the life of renunciate and yogi. And Rinpoche more raised up almost like a child by Milarepa, and I identify a lot with Rinpoche because he's always getting into trouble. And the other aspect of this relationship is points to another way that Milarepa transmitted the Dharma. There's obviously tremendous emphasis on the various songs that he spontaneously presented according to the situation's demands. But a lot of the teachings are what I call situational teachings. He created situations in which people would wake up. He did this repeatedly, and there were not words necessary, but he presented and kind of wielded his command over the environment to point an exaggerated magnifying mirror back to the students as to what was really going on with them and what they might need to do moving forward. So I have a couple of brief readings connected with Rinpoche and Milarepa. So the first section reading is entitled Rinpoche's Fascination with India and His Negativity Towards Milarepa. Actually, students can have negativity toward their teacher. That was very satisfying to know. And they can become accomplished as major accomplished close students of that same teacher. And this points to a kind of interesting thing. Rinpoche was given a lot of responsibility by Milarepa, and he kind of viewed himself as one of the main guys, so to speak. And Milarepa sent him down to India to receive certain transmissions that he had not received. In fact, Milarepa had not gone to India. He was the first lineage holder, Tibetan lineage holder, who didn't just go back and forth and import Dharma to Tibet, was native-born Tibetan. So anyway, it was a big honor to be sent down to India to receive wisdom and bring them back to share with Milarepa. So this went to Rinpoche's head very quickly and led to a lot of interesting stories in the book. So here goes. Rinpoche's songs and Milarepa's songs are quite different. Rinpoche's songs are more technical. They describe his many adventures and use many images and words, whereas Milarepa's songs are like ordinary songs, very basic, very direct, and deep-rooted. Rinpoche was fascinated by the details of the various teachings he had gotten from India. He almost tried to treat them as merchandise, and he talked like a salesman about their qualities and the wonderful things he had received. He had also been very excited to see the mandalas of the divinities being demonstrated to him. It seems that all his songs are overloaded with his excitement and his fascination with India. His meetings with great gurus and all the miraculous occurrences that happened had impressed him so much. Rinpoche seemed to be so full of stories that he was not actually able to bring himself to meet Milarepa properly and fully. That is why, having said everything that he had to say, the thought occurred in his mind that there had not been a particularly welcoming gesture from Milarepa. Very violent, very negative thought occurred towards Justin Milarepa, and Rinpoche completely ceased being able to communicate thoroughly and fully with Milarepa at all. Rinpoche had a great deal of doubt. This is probably the first time that Rinpoche had such a violent negative reaction to Milarepa. This negative reaction occurred due to the tremendous feeling of achievement that had been building up all along while he was studying with Tupupa in India, and due to his excitement that he would be able to teach Milarepa what he had learned. It came about because he had been looking forward to his meeting with Milarepa, but Milarepa was not willing to receive his teachings. Actually, Milarepa did not regard Rinpoche's collections of teachings as the teachings of the Dakinis at all, but purely as Rinpoche's own intellectual speculations. He regarded Rinpoche's approach as too technical and thought that Rinpoche had not been able to work with himself. So, getting all excited about what you have to show to your teacher, and he brushes you off. That was Rinpoche's experience coming back, and it gets worse. So the next section I wanted to read is from one of my favorite songs of Milarepa, the story of the yak horn. Again, has to do with the relationship of Rinpoche and Milarepa and the way that Milarepa could create situations that wake one up or stop one's mind, actually. And so this section is called The Yak Horn and the Nature of Miracles. After these exchanges, Milarepa and Rinpoche set out on their journey into the mountains to meditate. On the way, Milarepa asked Rinpoche to pick up an old yak horn for him. Later, as they were crossing a treeless plain, a great storm rose up and began to be pelted with rain and hail. Rinpoche looked around for shelter, but in the open field there was none. On top of that, Milarepa seemed to have disappeared, and Rinpoche had no idea where he had gone. But then he heard Milarepa's voice coming from inside the yak horn, which Rinpoche had carelessly dropped on the ground. When Milarepa and Rinpoche got to Patsang, which is one of the very famous fields or big open plains in Tibet, rain and hail started coming down. Rinpoche got so confused and excited about all that was happening that he completely forgot Milarepa, his guru. Rinpoche had regarded Milarepa's collecting of yak horns as very childish, and this phrase came to his mind. When dogs get old, they get more hot-tempered, and when men get old, they get more passionate and possessive. But while Rinpoche was being pelted by hail, it turned out that Milarepa was safe inside the horn. In this story, although Milarepa was sitting in a yak horn, the interesting point is that the yak horn did not become bigger, and Milarepa did not become smaller. That is an important point in relation to miracles. A miracle is not just a magic show or conjuring trick. You cannot miraculously change water into fire, and you cannot go against the force of nature or the force of karmic power. Miracles can only occur when certain mental meeting points with certain mental meeting points or hallucinations. Such hallucinations or mental meeting points could turn an ordinary situation into a miracle. That is why it is particularly interesting that Milarepa never became smaller and the yak horn never became bigger. If you examine Milarepa's figure and you examine the horn, you would see just a yak horn and Milarepa, just natural, ordinary things as they are. But the strange coincidence is that being as they are somehow able to fit into one another. With this kind of hallucination, you could fit everything into that yak horn. You could build the whole gigantic universe on one bubble without that universe becoming smaller or the bubble becoming bigger.
Yeah, we're going to claim an extra 10 minutes.
We started late.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Those were really wonderful. So we have a whole bunch of themes that we thought we would explore. Though time is tight, we definitely want to leave some time for questions from everybody here. One voice that we haven't really, that's sort of been invisible here is that of Tsongyong Haruka, who it's because of him that we have the Life of Milarepa in the way that we have it, and that we have the 100,000 songs that we have it. What, from your point of view, Andy, having done so much work on this, has he added to this, or what has he sort of highlighted?
Thank you for that question. So for those of you who might not know, the author of this version of the life story that I translated for Penguin Classics, his name is Tsongyun Haruka. And it translates to something like the Haruka, the blood drinker, madman from Tsang. Tsang is a western region of Tibet where he was from. So when I'd mentioned that I've spent almost 3 decades now thinking and writing and exploring and researching about the life of Milarepa, one of the things that led me to write The Yogin and the Madman was to try and answer the question of what made this version, this story, so enduring. And enduring not only for Tibetan readers, but also for readers in the modern West, because it's so captivating for both of those audiences which seem so far apart. And yet it seems that there's something elemental in the story, in the crafting of narrative, in the language that's used, that's able to captivate readers from 2 very different cultural perspectives. So that was the sort of question that I set about trying to answer. And much of the answer to that question has to do with the author and editor Tsongyun Haruka, his ability to craft narrative, but also the way he implicates himself in the story. So one of the kind of standard ways of understanding the life of Milarepa is that accounts of his life and of his poetry had been handed down from tradition to tradition in oral form until Tsongyun Haruka came some 400 years later and collected all of those oral accounts and put them into writing. But when you go and you start to look at the landscape of texts that exist in Tibet, you find a very different picture. In fact, people have been recording and writing elements of Milarepa's life and his songs for hundreds of years, so that we have some fragments, probably from about the time that he lived, that were written down by his disciples, and that we have very extensive versions of his life story within a generation of his death. So much so that probably 80%, maybe even more, of the content of Tsongyun Haruka's text existed in writing prior to his version, which was finished in 1488. So what did Tsongyun Haruka do? Well, he was a very astute author and editor. I think he had a very gifted sense of plotting and pacing, so that he changed the arrangement of certain aspects of the story so that they progressed in a kind of narrative progression in a way that built suspense, kept the reader's attention. He paid very close attention to developing the personalities and qualities of individual characters, like the mother who's driven insane by her desire for revenge, or the pathos of Milarepa's difficulties as he's enduring the trials of his guru, or in difficulties in meditation, things like that. That's another element. But there's a final piece to the puzzle that was really important that was never clear to readers in the West. And it's unclear how clear it was to readers in Tibet. And that is that the author, Tsongyen Haruka, actually identified himself not only as a follower in Milarepa's tradition, which he did. He himself was a mad saint, a wandering yogi. So he was espousing the tradition of Milarepa as a yogi. But he actually recognized himself as a re-embodiment, as a reincarnation of Milarepa. So that when, as an author, Tsongyen Haruka changes the story from what had previously been a third-person narrative, which say that Milarepa did this, he was born, he went there, he did that. He changed it from a third-person account into a first-person autobiography. I, Milarepa, was born here, and then I went to this place, and then I meditated here and had this experience. That transformation, which might appear to us to be a false autobiography, is actually a real autobiography. It is our author, Tsongyen Haruka, writing 400 years after his biographical subject, actually ventriloquizing the voice of his previous embodiment. And this invested the text with a certain kind of authority that I think was very profound among traditional readers.
So we're getting sort of waves.
5 minutes Q&A.
Okay, but I just wanted to keep, I'd love to hear from Holly and Judy a little bit briefly on how you feel that the story of Milarepa, like, what does that mean for us today? I mean, I think Judy, with what Trungpa Rinpoche did, really like bringing this tradition alive for us today, and so much of the work that you do in present day Tibet context with your book on Tari Lama and Namcho Rinpoche, like, what does it mean for us to, or you personally today, or us today?
Well, I think we could just start as readers of this text. And, I teach this text in my Tibetan Buddhism class at CU every year, and you watch the journey of the students as readers. And I think one of the big successes of this story, as Tsongyen Haruka tells it, is that we're engaged in the very poignant exercise of doubt about what is going on. Especially, I think, the interactions between Marpa and Milarepa. So Marpa puts Milarepa through these incredible trials, building towers. And, Milarepa builds a tower, and then Marpa comes along drunk and says, tear it down, And another occasion he scolds him, beats him up, he withholds the teachings, and it's this really intense process of induction. And later we find out that this is all to purify, Milarepa's past negative karma of having killed his relatives and created this hailstorm. But there's an incredible dramatic effect. So Tsongyen Haruka kind of strings us along, doubting, is Marpa the compassionate guru, or is Marpa an irascible drunkard who yells at his wife and his students, and even his wife, Dagmema, is trying to help Milarepa because she's not sure Marpa's ever going to give him the teachings, and she actually sends him to another teacher, trying to help him out. And I think that's the dramatic arc, the plot line and the character development that Andy was talking about. It still engages us today because we're engaged in the very process that students of Tibetan Buddhism are engaged in, which is, doubting or having questions about this central figure of the guru and having to resolve them over time. And so there's this wonderful moment at the end where Marpa finally reveals, that all along he's really been trying to help Milarepa, and you have these certain times where you see him weeping after he's been cruel, and so there's almost this deus ex machina where everything is resolved and everyone's in tears and everyone's joyful, and then they have a grand feast. But I think that reconciliation and the faith in the Guru is actually only comes after this very long process of doubt and questioning. And I think that's a very potent communication about the nature of the Guru-disciple relationship and about how to be readers of that and understand that both in a Tibetan context and here today.
Well, I was introduced to Milarepa in a very kind of a personal way, as many other folks have been who were students of Trungpa Rinpoche. The teachings on Milarepa was the very second seminar that Trungpa Rinpoche gave when he first came to North America in 1970. The first one was on the jewel ornament of liberation. The second one was on the yogic songs of Milarepa. And this book includes other seminars as well. But and he made it clear in introducing these teachings that he wasn't presenting an interesting story of something that happened long ago in Tibet as kind of an exotic and colorful figure. He was presenting it to really new students who had no clue about Tibetan Buddhism for the most part, but had a deep longing to immerse in some kind of true path and true Dharma. He presented these teachings very much as instructions to the very students who were sitting right in front of him through the vehicle of the songs of Milarepa. It was also at a period in the early 70s, the 2-volume set of the Milarepa songs was there weren't very many books on Tibetan Buddhism at that time, and that was a collection of stories and songs people studied over and over again. There were only a few books, so you just read them over and over again. Like there were 6 books. Everybody knew the same 6 books. And so that was another factor. There was a text that could be worked with. But he almost belabored the point. As you read the book, you will see, almost belabored the point of, watch out, don't distance yourself from this story. Or make your current path safer thereby. But these are the things that happened then to those kind of special people somehow. He was very much pointedly extracting those elements of the stories that could give his early fledgling students some clue of how to work with their minds and what it might be like to work with a teacher for people who are just exploring that possibility and just meeting, having no models, having no notion of what it is to work with a Vajra master. So it was very, I guess you'd call it, it had a purpose. It was being taught with a particular purpose, to introduce people to a deeper view of meditation and to a very gritty view of the spiritual path, because there was a lot of romanticism and idealism that was being cut through as well in the vehicle of these stories. The nicey nice, beautiful, perfect guru and the nicey nice, wonderful devotee students. That was not flying, and it didn't fly ever. But, but we hoped it would. So anyway, that's how I was introduced to these stories, and
Yeah.
I think.
Great.
Take just one question, I think.
Okay, sorry, just time for one question. Who's got the best one in the room? Or a pretty good one?
Everyone is so selfless.
Yeah.
It can be an okay question.
How about a really bad question?
Yes.
So when you say this tradition came out of southern Tibet, did it have a major impact in Lhasa and in the eastern and northern part? Is it really the tantric connected to Bengal, the bone? I'm just wanting a clarification.
Well, I think, as Namita put it very well, that Milarepa really is maybe the Himalayan saint. He was born in southern Tibet, and he lived his entire life in a fairly small, like self-contained geographical range on the Tibetan side of the Himalayas and also on the Nepalese side. He didn't travel a whole lot. Everyone in Tibet from the Buddhists to the small communities of Tibetan Muslims and even Christians in the Tibetan Buddhist sphere knew of Milarepa. I think even as you push on the margins of Tibetan Buddhist culture, from north into Mongolia and east into China and south into India and even Sri Lanka, Milarepa was known far and wide, and he's equally revered by everyone. In that sense, he really is the archetype for what it means to be a Buddhist practitioner, to live a deeply introspective life of meditation, of solitude and practice.
Okay, I think we're wrapped up. Okay. Thank you, all of our panelists. Namita, for